Hello and welcome everyone to the first of our 10-part series where we're going to be walking you through how to take your idea and turn it into an income stream. So I'm Rick Vazza. I'm going to be hosting you along this journey. Normally, I'm going to be interviewing subject matter experts as we talk about their respective fields and how it can impact your progression to ultimately launching and scaling your business. Today, though, we're going to be talking finance, and that's my lane. So I'm going to be with you guys the entire way. We're going to be hitting some of the most important components that you should be thinking about prior to actually launching your business. Right at this stage, we ultimately want to figure out, do you have a viable business plan, or do you have something that maybe is better left as a hobby? And so you've probably heard the term know your numbers repeatedly. Maybe you've watched Shark Tank, maybe you've started diving into business books, but know your numbers is a really critical component as you look to have success upon launching your business. And we want to ensure that by doing some work up front, you're going to give your business the highest chance of success. And so in this particular section of the module, we're going to be walking through, number one, understanding what business expenses you have. Then we're going to be jumping into your personal expenses. Believe it or not, a lot of times it's the personal spending that actually derails your business. So we'll identify ways that you can prohibit that from happening. Thirdly, we're going to put together some preliminary projections so that you can really answer the questions that most new business owners have a hard time answering, particularly what's the right price point for my service or product, and how many customers do I need to be starting to make some money. And lastly, we're going to move into how you put together a high-level business plan so that you can really hit the ground running and start delivering value to the customers that you want to be attracting for your business. So if you haven't done so already, I want you to pause the course, hop into the template that we've provided you. I'm going to walk you through each section so we can go through step by step all of these different processes. By the end of this, you're going to have a really clear vision on, am I ready to launch or not? So go ahead and pause, pull up that template, and we'll hop over to it. All right, so what we're looking at here is a preliminary budget that you want to be putting together for your business. Essentially, what is it going to cost you to actually hit the ground running? And you'll see I've broken this into two sections. So we have your upfront expenses as well as your ongoing monthly expenses. And it's important to recognize the difference because ultimately the upfront costs are likely coming directly from your savings, or you're going to need to find outside financing, whether that's a bank loan or another investor that's going to be able to help you actually put this business into motion. And so by going through and identifying what are the clear upfront costs that are going to be associated with launching, you're going to know exactly what you need. And again, whether you're personally going to be able to finance that, or if you are going to an outside investor, you're going to be very clear on what your ask is and why you need that particular money. Now, secondly, the monthly and ongoing expenses, naturally as you're starting your business, you're going to have revenues ultimately that are going to exceed your expenses. If you don't plan on that happening, probably don't want to start the business. But there is going to be potentially a lag time as you're getting up and running where your revenues are going to be lower than your expenses, and there might be a deficit there that that is required as you're ramping up. And so what's going to be important is as you start thinking about what are the ongoing costs of operating your business, you'll really get a clear line of sight into what is your break-even point, right? How much revenue do you need to be making just to simply let the business operate on its own so that you're not funneling more of your savings into the business or having to go back to outside investors repeatedly in order to continue to get cash infusions just to simply operate. And so the clearer understanding you have of what those differences are, naturally the more confidence and conviction you're going to have in making your decisions on a go-forward basis. Now, what I've put together is really some of the most common expenses that I see as I dig into companies' balance sheets and P&Ls. Particularly, these are the different line items that come up fairly frequently. Of course, make it your own. Make this relevant to your business model. Go ahead and clear out some of these items, but I wanted to put them in there just to start stimulating the thought process in case these were going to be any items that you maybe would overlook. And if you're already intimidated and thinking, God, I don't know the answer to a lot of these questions, well, it's kind of the point because you do want and need to know the answer to these questions. You want to start doing some preliminary research and understanding your industry and what the cost of operation is going to be. So don't take it lightly. And in fact, you really want to be diving through and getting a solid understanding of what these expenses are going to be before you really move on to the next step. because this will also help us in figuring out, who are your competitors, doing some market analysis and research. You're going to really be uncovering a lot as you go through this process of identifying the expenses you can anticipate. So take a moment before even moving into the next section, go ahead and start identifying, what you think the cost of operation is going to look like, both from an upfront standpoint as well as an ongoing cost of operations. And it's really critical as we get down to the total here of what the financing is going to be to understand what that break-even point is, because we're going to be coming back to that when we put together our projections in a couple sections from now. All right, so once you finalize that, you're ready to hop into the next tab here, which is going to be your personal expenses. And I've put together this budget for you guys so that you can get a really clear understanding of what your living expenses are. As I mentioned in the intro, believe it or not, a lot of times it's our personal spending that actually blows up the business. We're used to living in the age of Amazon, where we expect things to happen immediately. But the simple fact of the matter is, oftentimes starting and launching a business takes time, right? It takes time to develop your network, to showcase your credibility and expertise, to become referable. Some of these things just can't happen overnight. There's a natural progression that's going to take place. So the longer runway you can build with your personal budget, the longer you can go without necessarily taking a salary or taking as high of a salary from the business, the better, right? You're going to give yourself a higher chance of success. So as you're going through this personal budget, really hone in on what are the different line items where if push came to shove, you could really tighten your belt. Maybe you could cut back on some, entertainment or personal care. Maybe you're saving a little bit on the groceries. And then identify, what are some non-negotiables. And particularly if you have a spouse or a significant other, it's important that you go through this with them. Even if they're not going to be directly part of the business, whether you like it or not, they are going to be, because you're likely going to be venting to them. They might be supporting you financially. There's a lot of contact and dialogue that needs to happen in order to make sure this has the highest probability of success. So I'd encourage you to go through that with them and really get a sense of, is this a living expense scenario that you guys can stomach, before taking this journey. The last thing you want is to go, jump into this and 2 years from now figure out that, hey, this is actually taking a little bit longer than we anticipated. And just as your business is about to turn the corner, just as that momentum is starting, you need to drop out because you couldn't keep living the lifestyle that you wanted given the salary that you weren't able to take. Right? So if we can really hone in on these different line items and figure out, where are maybe some areas that if push came to shove, we can trim, that would be an amazing opportunity to really dig in there. Now, the next component that I put together is for your savings. So what I want you to think about is, realistically, if I'm going to launch this business, where is that money coming from? Right? What savings am I comfortable utilizing to start this business, right? To cover those upfront costs, and then potentially any sort of gap that is going to exist between revenues and expenses in that initial ramp up period, right? So that would be what we'd call working capital that you'd maybe be putting into the business to help offset some of that deficit. And what I've found is, there's, again, having dialogue with your significant other is important if you have one, because there may be some savings that you don't want to earmark for the business, right? That's just kind of personal, and you aren't going to tap into that if you need to, whereas other parts of your savings absolutely might be earmarked for the business. So go ahead and plug in exactly what those are going to be. For example, when I launched my business, I had a combination of my savings account as well as the contributions I had made to my Roth account, over several years of working in the corporate life that I utilized to put into my business. And I felt very comfortable and confident doing that because I went through this exact process of understanding my numbers and knowing what my personal runway was going to be. The other piece that I did to help you guys is I've plugged that in. So when you put in your savings, it's actually going to sum here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be dividing your monthly spending by that savings. So we want to have a good understanding of how much runway you've actually put together. How many months of savings, if you aren't able to draw a salary whatsoever, because right now I have this listed as a 0 for you guys. How many months of savings do you have that you could realistically continue living the lifestyle you want without having to draw a salary? What's nice is even as you start seeing that expected salary increase, you can go ahead and plug that right in, adjust your taxes accordingly, and you'll have a good line of sight into that number increasing, because naturally now you're going to be able to offset it as you're taking some money from operating the business. But again, what we're trying to do here is always err on the side of being conservative. You want to give yourself the highest opportunity possible for success, and this ultimately is going to allow you to do that by being very clear on what that runway looks like as you go forward launching the business. All right, so now at this point, we have a clear line of sight into what it's going to cost us to open and operate the business. We know exactly what our personal expenses are going to be, and we have enough savings built out so that we have a bit of a runway in case we're not able to draw the salary that we're used to drawing from our new business venture. Now we're going to be able to move forward and actually start figuring out the projections for the business, right? Understanding if this thing can be profitable, make the money that you ultimately need it to make in order to start drawing a real salary. So we're going to hop into the revenue projections here. And so what I've put together is a model, that whether you're a service-based business or a product-based business, this will work either way. And so what we're really trying to do, and the beautiful thing of going through this sequence, is we're now going to be able to answer one of the hardest questions that most new entrepreneurs have presented to themselves is, what do I price at? So many of us have imposter syndrome. We've just launched a business that we typically are discounting and undercutting our prices. But now, because you've gone through your expenses, you know exactly what you need to do to break even. You know exactly what you need to do to draw the salary that you need. So you inevitably are going to know exactly what you need to price at in order to hit those two buckets that we've already outlined. And so this is why it's so critical to go through this sequence, because now when we go together, we can figure out, okay, how many clients do I need per month? What price do I need to be charging them in order to hit those metrics that I've outlined? And just simply through that, we're able to identify what is the gross revenue that we're going to have, and we can back out those expenses to make sure that the business makes sense. And of course, as you're going through that process, you're going to be able to ask yourself, is the price point viable given the value that I can bring to clients, given the competition, the marketplace? And if the answer is no, you really got to start thinking about, is there other ways that I can increase value to make that price point worth it? Or do I simply not have a viable business here? Am I not going to be able to actually meet my operating expenses and draw the salary that I expect to draw if I actually put this business into motion? And going through this now is so critical, because could you imagine if you went through this process 3 years into your business where you've spent all of this money up front launching, all of a sudden you're dipping into your savings to pay your bills, and it gets to the point where no matter how much product you sold, you still wouldn't be making enough money because your price point was off, because the number of clients you needed was unattainable. By figuring all of this out now, you're going to have very clear intentions as you go to launch your business. You're going to be able to be very specific in who you're targeting, and you're not going to shy away when people ask what your pricing is, because you're going to have the confidence and conviction to respond to that, knowing that you've done your homework and understanding exactly why that price point makes sense. So as you can tell, this is really one of the most critical components right before taking this big adventure and jumping into entrepreneurship. And what I've done for you guys here is you start loading in the expense information on the previous tabs that's actually going to pull in for you. So you're going to see your upfront business expenses loaded in. You're going to see your ongoing expenses loaded in. All of these things will pull. I've built the template for you to do that. And so you're going to start to see all of these things start reducing from your savings, right? So we have our little ready to launch kind of question here, and your savings minus your upfront expenses, any working capital or buffer that you need to provide as those revenues ramp up, your living expenses. In this case, I've built you a 3-year runway. So we've basically looked to obtain 36 months of coverage so that, God forbid, you can't draw a salary as quickly as expected. You're not going to have the business get derailed because of your personal spending, right? You're going to be able to tap into those things. Another thing that you could build in yourself would be if you have any significant other support. I was fortunate to have that when I launched my business, so we were able to offset some of our typical living expenses because of my wife's salary. So if you have any of that, you can include that there as well. And then ultimately, if you have a surplus, you're good to go. Let's get this process started. You've now done the homework. You've made sure you have viable business model in place and the projections make sense, and you have the financial wherewithal to actually do this. So at this point, now that you have conviction in your numbers and you understand that the business model from a finance standpoint makes sense, it's time to hop into doing a high-level business plan. And so what I've put together for you on this fourth and final tab are really just some of the questions that you want to be answering. And I want to be very clear about this. I have run into so many people that have shown me their 40-page business plans where they're talking about office number 5 in the 3rd state that they're going to be opening. And they're really going into all of this detail that frankly at this stage is not necessary, right? What we want to be focusing on is what is our actual go-to-market strategy, where we're figuring out right now, we know that we have a viable business. How are we going to approach the customers that we want immediately so that we're starting to generate revenue and become profitable and ultimately then focus on scaling? But you don't need to get so far ahead of yourself that you're digging into this business plan and frankly wasting a lot of time, because a lot of those things in that business plan are going to change. What I want you to do is put this together high level so you have a clear understanding of the direction you're moving in, and then really just focus on executing, right? Taking action and doing these things, which all of you are. You've already signed up for a course like this, so clearly you're very intentional about taking action. You're not just gonna be letting this sit on the wayside and carrying dust, which so often happens with these intense business plans that are overdone. So answer these questions. At this stage, don't skip over core values. A lot of people kind of roll their eyes, but really you're never gonna have more time as a business owner than you have now. Right? When you're a business owner, there's constantly fires, there's new clients, there's new ideas, there's so many things that you have going on that by setting some time aside to really figure out what your core values are now, the type of business that you want to be building, the type of team that you want to be attracting, doing that at this stage is going to be critical. And you might have more, you might have less than 6 core values. I just put that on there to kind of get you the idea stimulated for you guys. But really spend a little time up front to figure that out. And after that, you're going to move into, what is the purpose, the vision of your company? What problem are you solving? What service are you providing? And really figure out who is that. A lot of times you'll hear it described as an avatar. Who's that ideal client, right? If you could pick anyone that's your dream person to work with or sell your product to, who is that? And as we go into your marketing strategy, you're going to really start to be able to answer the questions as figuring out who that target client is by asking, who are they? Where are they? What do they appreciate? How are you wowing them, right? What are you doing that is making you stand out from your competitors? And this is really where you're starting to get into that competitive analysis and figuring out what makes you different. Why are they picking you versus the person either down the street or now in this virtual, business place that we're working? The online might be an option. You might be competing with people across the country or even in different countries. So you want to be asking those questions. And then, one of my favorite lessons from the book Traction is the component here about your company difference and your guarantee, pledge, commitment, like the promise that you're making to your client. So you want to be thinking about these types of things as well as you're getting started on this, eventually this big journey that you're about to undertake. All right, everyone, that concludes episode 1. We have 9 more of these episodes packed full of information, workbooks, and templates, everything you need to start and scale your business. Remember, in this episode, we talked about how important it is to know your numbers, and we walked through the different scenarios, the projections that you can put forward and questions you can answer to ultimately say, yes, I have a viable business and I'm ready to start this journey. If you've gone through and answered all of that and you've landed on yes, well, the exciting part has just started, and now we're gonna be hopping over and talking to a web designer about everything you need to know of starting and building your website. So we'll go ahead and see you over there.